Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to the session about the Drupal 8 Entity API. My name is Wolfgang Ziegler, or Fargo in the Drupal community, or the real Fargo on Twitter. I'm the maintainer of the Entity API module, or the co-maintainer of the Entity and Form core components. And you might also know me from various contrib modules like the rules module, field collection, or Profile 2. And I run a company in Vienna, Tronomics, of which I'm the CEO. So this talk will start a little bit of history of the Entity API. And it's, if you have seen the talk on the Drupal camp in Vienna, it's quite similar to that one, but it has been updated to match all the changes that happened meanwhile. And it's pretty much the same talk that I gave in Drupal camp in Szeged, Dev Days, just a month before. So if you've seen that, that's probably nothing new for you. Yeah, so I'll explain you how you can work with entities in Drupal 8 and fields as well. And we'll see how you can provide a new entity type, how you can use validation API, querying. We'll learn about configuration entities and type data, and lastly we also compare all that stuff to the Drupal 7 entity module. So who of you knows the Drupal 7 entity module? Okay, quite some bit. And who has actually developed stuff with it? Okay, also quite some people, good. So entities in Drupal 7, they really evolved as a side effect of the field API. So in Drupal 7, CCK got vastly improved while it was ported to Drupal core and got renamed to the field API. And it was decoupled from just supporting nodes like CCK in Drupal 6 to support all kind of different objects on Drupal 7. And that really was how the notion of an entity became to life. So it was introduced very late in the cycle in Drupal 7. So initially it was just like different kind of objects. And then developers recognized that, okay, it would make sense to introduce an underlying concept. So the Entity API was born. And as it was so late in the cycle, it was really unfinished for Drupal 7. Or it is really unfinished in Drupal 7 core. So the entity module really helps us with that and finishes a lot of stuff, or at least tries to finish it, but Drupal 7 core leaves open. Sometimes it's not very easily possible for the entity module because it has to work around of it, because it's not in core. So it tries to bring the additions, but sometimes it has to work around what core does. So in Drupal 8, the great thing is now we can really improve that from core directly. And that is really what we have been doing for Drupal 8. We worked on bringing all the improvements of the Entity API module directly to Drupal 8 core. So we just put Entity module in Drupal 8 and we're done. So as I explained, sometimes Entity module has to work around the things in core. Now we can do better in Drupal 8, and for that we really wanted to improve the things, also to work in object-oriented way, like it's now standard for Drupal 8. So we want to have class-based entity objects based on my well-defined interface. So we have an entity interface in Drupal 8 core, and we also have full CRUD storage controllers. Really, that's one of the basic things that one would expect from a completed Entity API. So that's all there. We have that in Drupal 8 core, but that's not enough. We need more. We also need. Was a question or no? Okay. We also need unification of fields and properties. Like in Drupal 7, there's always the difference of like a node title. No, it's not a field. It's handled totally different, like the node body, which is a field. So for Drupal 8, we don't want that difference. So we've worked on that, and also on having enough metadata about all fields and properties on an entity. Then we need a way to validate an entity independently of form submissions. I'll talk about more on that later on. And also we need to have reusable components built on top. So to a lot of people, I think in Drupal 7 they mostly think of entities as the content of the Drupal site. But actually for Drupal 8, all the things are entities. So basically everything is an entity. Like when you have some content, it's entity, but also like configurations, things like when you have configuration that gets added and managed on your site, like node types, that's an entity in Drupal 8 as well. So it's a configuration entity. So we have two different flavors of entities. So we have some content entities like the nodes, or the configuration entities like node types. But also much more is a configuration entity, like a view is an entity, or the block placement on the site. All that stuff that gets stored and added via the interface is stored as a configuration entity. So for that we have two different interfaces also, which depict all the differences between the content and configuration entities. So in this talk, I'll focus mostly on content entities, because that's are the ones that you will have to work a lot with. But I'll cover config entities in some short slides as well, but I'll explicitly mention that then. So let's see how you can work with entities in Drupal 8. So first off, we have a so-called entity manager. That's a central service in Drupal 8, which provides you with all that functionality around entities that you need. It's in the dependency injection container, and you can get to the entity manager always via the global Drupal class, calling the entity manager method. Yes. Then on the entity manager, you can call get storage controller to get the storage controller of each entity, like for comments, and from there on you can like load, save, and everything. You have all that methods to treat to handle the storage of an entity type. Right now we are actually working on adding a shortcut also to that, which says like entity class load. So you can do comment load, node load, and it's really a convenient shortcut, and basically deprecates the functions that you know, like node load and comment load. But in Drupal 8 you should only use that when you are like in a global context, when you are in a hook implementation where you don't have the dependency injection container available. Else, if you are writing a class, you should inject the entity manager and use the first variant. Then, as said, an entity in Drupal 8 is an object based on a defined interface. So it has some convenient methods. You can get the entity type of it, and the label, or also the ID. Of course, there are more, but that's like the really basic ones. So entity types, also in Drupal 8, are objects. So what you might know as hook entity info, it's a huge array which has some information about each entity type. In Drupal 8, that's a domain object, which means entity type is an object, an instance of the entity type class, and it has convenient methods on it. Like just instead of checking all the individual array keys of hook entity info, you call them methods. Like you can call the method get class to obviously get the entity class, use has key to check for the entity keys array to see whether it has a label key or a bundle key and so on. And you can use the is subclass of shortcut to easily check whether it's a content entity or a config entity. Yes, then there are some field definitions. We'll see more that later on. We'll skip that for now. Then for work on an entity, actually we also have now a totally new object-oriented API, which should help you to easier access the individual field values. Like in Drupal 7, you probably know you have to use all that brackets, language none, and always have to go for the first item, and then you have to access the value, and it's very verbose and complicated, I will say, to access the right value, because when it gets into translation, it's even more complicated, and you can just use always the same language none variant. So in Drupal 8, we made it easier, and we have an object-oriented API, which by default always goes with the default language. So by default, you don't have to care about language. You just access the field like field tags, and that's an object as well, and it's an object which contains just individual field items. So in that example, you can access here like the field tags field, then you use the third field items, and from there we can just access the entity, which is the tag that's referenced here, and as that's an entity object as well, you can just use it to access the name and the value of it. So it's a very fluent API which makes accessing field values easier. There are also some methods like hasField, which allow you to easily check for the existence of fields, or if you have a field item, you can easily get back the entity object as well. And updates work as you would expect it. You can just like set a new value on it and can save the entity immediately. And what you see here, also in this example, we have a title which is called field, which should, you can think of, you might think already, okay, the node title works differently, but no, it actually doesn't. The node title works exactly like that as well, because it's a field now already. But we'll see that later. So methods. We have entity type specific methods on most of our entity type classes already in Drupal 8. So that means like the comment class, it has methods which make sense for comments. The node class has methods which make sense for nodes. And they're there for you to use, and it makes really sense if you're writing node-specific code, and it ends up in more useful and better readable code. So just use them. And if you're providing an entity type, provide them. Translation, already shortly mentioned. By default, if you don't care about translation, we'll just go with the default translation. But of course, you can access different translations of an entity. So for that, there's the getTranslation method, which just passes the language code, and you get back actually a full entity object again. And the full entity object works exactly the same as the original one. It just holds the translated language. And then there are some convenience method on it, like the language method. So you can ask the entity or the translation object what kind of language it actually is. And there's also an important method on the entity manager, which is called getTranslation from context. And it will give you basically always that translation that you should display on your site. Like when you go on a page to see a node, it should use that translation, because that's the translation that uses a language negotiation and everything to make sure to pick the right translation for a user to look at. So if you're about to display something, first get the right translation, and then like in example, you can easily access the label, and you will be sure that you get the label in the right language for the user. If you don't use the method and just use the entity as it's loaded from entity load, it will just output the default language, which is the language the entity has been written in originally. And of course, if you have a translated entity object, you can always get back the original one by calling getUntranslated on it, and it will give you back the original object. Yeah, so the API also supports iterating. So when you iterate over an entity object, it will just go for all the fields, whereas as in Drupal 7, a field always consists of a list of field items. So actually, the items is an instance of the field item list interface, and you can iterate on that as well. And you will go for all the field items, which are classes as well. Those are instances of the field item interface, and will hold all the individual field item properties, like if you have a text field, it will just contain a value property which holds the text, but it will also contain like the text format property, which will just hold the configuration of which text format has been selected. And for entity references, there's a target ID property, and there's also a computed entity property, which you can just call, and it will automatically contain the loaded entity object, the referenced entity object for you. So as you see, we can loop over the entity and everything that it's giving us then our field item lists, and that's working, as everything on a content entity is a field in Drupal 8. So like what you know as node properties in Drupal 7, the node title, status, and stuff like that are all fields in Drupal 8. But they are a little bit different as the field API fields that you know, because in Drupal 8 we have different flavors of fields. So we have base fields and we have bundle fields. So the base fields are basically what you traditionally know as the entity or node properties, like node title, node ID, or also username and user roles. They are basically fields that every entity of an entity type has. Like when you have a node and you have different node types, regardless of the node type, each of the nodes will have that field. And in addition to that, we have bundle-specific fields. So those are the fields that are specific to a node type, like the node text or the node body. Only the nodes which are of a certain bundle for which those fields have been configured will have that field. Yeah. So basically all configurable fields, all field API fields are bundle fields, so they're all bundle specific. So coming to configurable fields, that's the new term that we are using for field API fields, because field API fields are really just a special case of the general field API now that we have in Drupal 8. It are just the fields that are exposed by the interface and for which their configuration gets managed by the configuration management system. So yeah, they're configurable. So they're implemented and provided by the field module as in Drupal 7. And as I said, they store the configuration by the configuration system and they appear in the UI. And from code-wise, you can really work the same with them as the base fields. There's no difference. So as a developer, you don't have to care unless you really are doing specifics like you want to provide a configurable field. So there's an API which really allows modules to provide new fields and based upon some hooks. So there's hook entity base field info, which basically allows you to define new base fields for an entity type. And there's also hook entity bundle field info, which allows you to add new bundle fields, which also the field module implements. And of course, of a field, you can always ask a field of who's the provider of it, and it will give you the module. Also, field storage got quite changed in Drupal 8. Because we moved the field storage to be into the entity storage. So it's now part actually of the entity storage. So if you think of a node, in Drupal 7 the storage was split, like there was the storage of the entity and the storage of the field system. And in Drupal 8 we realized it doesn't really make sense that way, so we unified that, and so that we have single storage controllers per entity type. So the storage of a field is always the job of the entity. It's possible via the API to define fields which are handled with custom storage. So basically by default the storage is handled by the entity storage, but you can define a field to have custom storage and you can take over. And there are also fields without storage, which are so-called computed fields. So those are actually fields that just compute the field item properties when they are accessed. We already have seen an example of that, which is the referenced entity. It's not like a stored value. It's like on the entity reference, when you access it, it's automatically computed, and it's just for convenience. We have another example of that in Drupal 8 core, which is the processed property, and it's available on text fields. So it will automatically contain the process text. So it applies the text format for you and gives you the result. So you can easily call node body processed and output that text. It's safe. As we already have seen the examples for entity references, you can easily call node UID, which is an entity reference entity, to get the referenced offer. And then as it's an entity object, move on as usual. Then when working with entities, of course, you want to know what fields does a certain entity type have. So you can easily ask an entity object of what are the field definitions of its fields, and it will give it back to you. And the field definition, it's basically the Drupal 8 version of the field info array of Drupal 7, like when you used field info fields to ask the field API about some information about the fields available. In Drupal 8, you would use the field definitions. And when you don't have an entity object yet, you can use the manager to ask him about field definitions, like you give him the entity type and the bundle, and you could get back all the definitions that are on that combination. And at the very same time, it's also, of course, possible to ask him about base fields only, entity manager get base field definitions node will give you all the base fields of the node, like title, status, created date, all that stuff. While calling get field definitions node and article will give you all fields that are on an article node. So it will include the base fields and the bundle specific fields. So I mentioned configuration entities, and now I talked a lot about fields. So you might wonder, so how's about configuration entities and fields? Actually, right now, only content entities have fields, and config entities don't work that way. They still have just plain properties that are directly stored. So that also has an impact when you work with those entities objects. So when you call node title on the content entity node, it's not a string, it's an object because it's a field item list, so you have to use node title value when you want to get the string. And on configuration objects, like on a view, if you call view name, it's actually a string because it's just a property and not a field. So configuration entities still have properties. Okay, so let's shortly look at how you can provide a new content entity type. Actually, it works pretty much the same for a configuration entity type. You just have to specify some additional information for the configuration management system, but else it's pretty much the same, but for simplicity, we'll be focusing on content entities here. So the central thing, of course, is the entity class of a content entity. So it works very similar as to the plugin system in Drupal 8, what means you basically define a class in the right location, you put some annotation on it, and the system automatically picks it up. Basically, you can copy over an existing entity type class, change the annotation as it fits, and that's it to define a new entity type. So the annotation, it's basically all that information that goes in the entity type object and resembles what in Drupal 7 is hook entity info. It's just a new format and a new way to define it. And of course, there are some new options, as you already see here. We have a lot of different controllers which we can specify. The different controllers like storage, access, view builder, they basically provide all the different further capabilities of your entity if you want to have them. And we have also reasonable default implementations for them. So for a lot of those, you can just pick the default implementation and you're good. Or of course, you can extend the default implementation to alter it, to provide some more specific implementations for your entity type and specify that. Then when you are defining the content entity, you always have, of course, to specify what kind of fields does your content entity have. So for that, you have to implement the base fields definitions method, and in there you just define multiple field definitions. Like here for the comment, it defines the comment ID. It says it's an integer field. You specify label description, and as it's the ID, it's read only. And it works just like that for all kind of fields. So you define all of those, and you're done. So for those fields, right now you also have to specify the schema. So you have to implement hook schema for that to work. But that's actually subject to change. I'll talk more on that later. But what's mostly and what's really cool, I think, about Drupal 8 is that those fields also can have field formatters and can have field widgets. And you can also specify them in your base field definitions method. So that's an example actually of the node title, which says, okay, the node title will also have a default display with a hidden label, and it's just outputted as it is a string. And there also is a formatter specified. And you can also control whether people should be able to override that, so it's whether it's just a default and people can configure it on their own, or whether that's just as it is and it's not configurable via the UI. So that enables you as module developer to also make use of all the widgets and formatters, and you can lock it and people still cannot alter it. So that's very useful, I think. Yeah, of course, I do not have that as part of this presentation because often there's also a separate field API presentation, but also widgets and formatters have been converted to the plugin API in Drupal 8, and it's also very easy now to write a new widget or formatter. So it's very convenient to just provide the form and the display of your entity type by building it out of some widgets and formatters, and if something is left, instead of altering and providing a custom form or a custom view, you can easily do a custom widget and a custom formatter. So it's also reusable. Yeah, then storage. Of course, there are storage classes which by default handle full CRUD functionality. But sometimes that's not enough and you need to add more storage methods, like comments need a way to get the maximum thread number, which it traditionally, for which it traditionally did additional SQL queries. In Drupal 8, when you do an additional SQL query, move it to the storage class. Make it a dedicated method, so it's clear that it accesses the storage, and for everyone who wants to swap out the storage, he can easily see where all the access to the storage layer is and can easily swap it out. But usually you don't have to do it. It's really just if you need additional queries. So it really depends on that. But you usually also have some sort of storage independent logic on an entity, like for comments. There is some thread locking, stuff like that. And that logic, it can go into the entity class directly. So there are some convenient methods on it which are named similar to the entity CRUD update hooks, like node insert, node pre-save, node update, stuff like that. For all of those events, there are methods on the entity class which are called before the hooks. So you can react first and you can do whatever makes sense for your entity type there, and just write that in your entity class. What's very convenient, and it's clearly separated from the storage, so everyone who wants to swap out the storage can do that easily by just swapping out the storage class. So as mentioned already, we have moved field storage into entity storage, which makes it more very convenient and easy to swap out the storage of a single entity type. And as everything on an entity now is a field, actually every content entity is fieldable. So those entities for which you can define additional fields are actually not called fieldable they are not called fieldable anymore. We call them extendable now. So actually the issue is still work in progress, and we are not 100% settled on the new name, but it will be probably extendable. Yeah. Then there's the view builder. We have already seen it as part of the entity annotation. Yeah, you can make use of the view builder easily to render an entity and all the fields. So you can just on the entity manager call get view builder comment and then call view on it to render the entity. Also for forms, there are services which take care of building the entity form of view. That's the way you have to access it right now. Maybe it will become a little easier. But by default, it will just have a fully working entity form containing all the field format, containing all the field widgets. And of course, you can also implement custom forms which add additional form elements to your entity form. There's also a controller for access control. It's by default invoking a hook, and you can customize it by implementing a simpler method. And of course, for working with other entity types, you can use the manager to get the access controller of a certain entity type and just call access on it. There's also a controller for generating lists of entities. This one is actually mostly used for configuration entities, like for node types or content categories. It just provides the usual overview screen where you see the list of entities, you can add a new one, stuff like that. So it's really convenient for building the administration screens. It's right now not used for content entities because all those lists are actually replaced by views in Drupal 8, so it's not really needed for those. But you might see all those controllers. There is really a common pattern behind of those controllers and how they work and how they are accessed. It's really the controllers, they provide us with reusable functionality based upon a well-defined interface. So it's like the view builder, access controller, all of that provide us with a well-defined interface we can work with. But more than that, they also allow us to easily customize certain aspects of an entity type, as you can easily override that class and then customize it where there is some sane default behavior. And also contrib modules can easily provide new kind of controllers. So you can basically just come up with your own interface and implement them as the existing controllers, and the other entity types then can pick that up and easily make use of it and easily do pair entity type customizations based on it. So for folks of you which also work with other systems, like worked with MVC systems, might be a little bit confused by our term controller, which is in particular confusing as Drupal 8 also has picked up the term controller for like menu page callbacks. Those are called controllers now as well in Drupal 8. So it's a little bit confusing to have that kind of controllers and entity controllers, which are totally not the same thing. So we have got an issue to rename controllers to handlers. Yeah, so lots of renaming things going on. I hope we'll actually be able to finish that one in time. So if you're keen to help is welcome. Then in addition to controllers, there's another pattern which is related to fields, which really allow you to provide reusable behavior along with storage for entity types. So by implementing a new field type, you can really easily do that, and we also have been applying that already in Drupal 8 core. Like we have got an UUID field for all the UUIDs that we have now on every entity, at least on every content entity. There's just a new field type which you can just specify, and it will have all the default behavior, like it's generating a UUID for a new entity, and it will save that. The UUID field, though, it has no UI, so it's not configurable via the interface. So it's usually just defined as part of your base field definitions. There's also a language field, which also comes with meaningful default values, like it has always the right default language for your entity type. Or we have got a path field, which is actually takes care of connecting the path system to your entity type. Like for nodes, we have the URL alias functionality, and that's powered by the new path field. And when you compare it to how that actually worked previously, we had a hook implementation where the path module had to do all the logic to take care of the field, so that was really spread all over the module. And now that's everything just in the path item, and that's the field type class, where we have also convenient methods like an insert method, an update method, so you can easily also react on the important events here to implement some custom business logic, what the path field does. Yeah, and we have more fields like created fields, changed fields, like all the fields that you regularly need. So for those, actually, we already have useful implementations in Drupal 8 core, which is content development. Of course, you can just pick up, or you can provide more useful field types. Then I shortly managed an entity validation API. Entity validation really is important because we need to decouple validation step from form submissions. Like when you think about Drupal being also a REST server in Drupal 8, when you submit some changes to an entity, of course you want that those changes are also properly validated, so it's taken care that the changes are good. So for that to work, we have separated all that validation logic out of forms, and it's gone via the entity validation API, which is based on the Symfony validator component. And this one works also now with constraint plugins, which means like for a field, you can specify some constraints like the maximum length of it, and the entity validation API will pick that up. Let's look at an example. That's the mail field of the user entity. It actually has a custom constraint which is called user mail unique, which just makes sure that the mail address is unique. And those constraints then you can also specify as part of the field definition. So there's the helper method, set property constraints, which allows us to set the constraint on the value of the email field. Yeah, and for providing a constraint, I don't have a providing slide. Okay, there are constraint plugins. Basically, you can just look at an example, copy it, and adapt it. It's not difficult to provide a constraint plugin, but there already are a lot of existing constraint plugins which you can just reuse. If you have some custom behavior, you have to provide your own plugin. Yeah, and the constraint plugins, they have convenient defaults based upon field types. Like I mentioned, we have a UUID field. The UUID field also has suiting validation logic, which can, for example, make sure that the maximum length validation fits the UUID field. Then how do we use the validation API? So if you want to validate an entity manually, you can just call entity validate, and what gets back is basically, oops, what happened now? Sorry about that. Here we are. So what we get back is a list of violations, and when you want to know whether the violation passed, you basically just check the count, and if the count of the violations is 0, the validation passed, and if it's greater than 0, then obviously we have a violation fail, and you also have access to a violation object, which has everything you basically need from it. Like it has the message, which is already translated. It also has pointer of where the violation occurred. So it has the property path, which is the path to the exact property where the violation fail happened. And it also can give you back the entity which has been validated. Yes. and then the widgets are the ones who are responsible for mapping those violations back to form errors. So when you're implementing the entity validation API, usually you don't have to take care of that because the regular widgets and all that form code does take care of mapping that back already to form elements. So when you implement entity validation, the system takes care of that it applies during the form and also for RESTful submissions. Then I shortly mentioned already entity querying. So of course, something like entity field query also exists in Drupal 8. It's now called entity query, and as there's no separation for properties and fields for content entities, it's just called condition. So it's easier to work with. You don't have to think what are you actually checking. And it also has some more features. It works independently of the storage. So for every storage type, you can provide a new entity query plugin as well. So that works also. And you really, in Drupal 8, you shouldn't directly query your database anymore. So entity query has been improved and is more conveniently to work with. Use that. And when you really need some custom queries, which are not possible with entity query, then you really should just extend the storage controller and put a method on it and do it there, as mentioned already. So you really shouldn't directly query your database anymore outside your storage controller or the entity query service. Also, entity query has now language support, so it's able to query a specific translation of your entity. It also has relationships, whereas the relationships only work as long as both entity types are stored in the same storage engine, like both are in MySQL, and it also is capable of doing aggregations, like counts. Yeah, so we have making use of entity queries is really important, so that we are able to plug out the storage, like if you want to use MongoDB. And even if you don't care about that, it's important for a full multilingual support, because only via that the translations are properly handled. And it's also important for being able to do schema changes without having to restructure all of the code, so that's way easier then. Okay, so now we've mostly looked at content entities. Let's have a short look at configuration entities as well. So basically, you have an annotation also. It's a specific annotation which says config entity type instead of content entity type, else the pattern works pretty much the same. No. One key. But the class implementation looks a bit different, as usually the properties are now defined here as public properties. Like this is an example of the node type. So the node type name and all its properties are just defined here as public properties. And actually what then gets stored in the configuration management system is defined by the toArray method, which by default just takes all those properties, and those then get stored to your configuration file. But you can override it by overriding the toArray method if you need to massage those values a little bit. Yes. And a lot of that stuff that we have been working on, like all the new field types, is based upon a new foundational API, the so-called type data API. It's something that you don't have to really take care of and know a lot about it when you are working it, but it's really helpful still for some sort of modules, and it's really is just an API about the metadata and being able to leverage the metadata. Like when you have an entity with fields, you are able to check what kind of fields are in there, and for a field you can check what kind of properties does it have. So that's the part the type data API ensures that all that metadata is available to you. So it's based upon an extendable list of data types, like strings, integers, floats, but also Drupal-specific stuff like entities, nodes, or specific field items. And it's mostly important for specific modules like REST module. Also the Drupal 8 rules module will totally be based upon that. and also C tools and the context system, therefore panels, stuff like that. So it's really the common foundational metadata layer for all that kind of modules then. Also Search API is already being ported to Drupal 8 and is also based upon the type data API. And hopefully tokens as well. So tokens can totally be just generated out of that information, and we'll make sure that we have that functionality for the routes module. It doesn't work like that right now in Drupal 8 core, but for sure we'll have at least a content module which you can turn on, and you will get all the tokens automatically, similar to the entity tokens module in Drupal 7. So type data really works based on top of the concept of primitive data, complex data, which is like a data structure which has some named properties, like an entity with fields or a field item with some properties, and lists of data. So it's just multiple values. So how does that all compare to the Drupal 7 entity API module? So the entity wrappers, which some of you might know, are really not necessary anymore because they're mostly already built in the entity classes, because they are now way more conveniently to use. So all that nice API is in there, so there's no need for the entity wrappers anymore. Then the entity API controller, which is the controller provided by the entity API module that makes providing entity types more easy. It's also not needed anymore, as we now have just all the different kind of controllers, which has the entity storage controller, and also the entity API controller had some diffuse functionality built in, so it's basically replaced by those two controllers. But as you have seen, we have way more controllers in Drupal 8 even. Then there is the entity property info system of Drupal 7, hook entity property info if you know it. It's also deprecated by all the field informations and field definitions that we have in Drupal 8, so that's also there. Then there has been a dedicated controller class called Entity API Controller Exportable, which has been doing something, or does something similar like configuration entities in Drupal 7. So that's totally replaced by the configuration entity system. But there are also some bits that are still missing that the Drupal 7 entity module did and are not there yet in Drupal 8. It's mostly something like entity UI controllers, which you can just turn on and you get a fully working UI. Right now in Drupal 8, you still have to manually define your routes, basically what is the new equivalent to the menu items. But there's actually some work going on generating the routes, which actually would come close then to having something like the entity UI controllers in Drupal 8. But what we are still lacking is something like an entity views controller, which automatically generates all the views integration for your entities. There's some work on thinking going on that, but it's not going. It hasn't gone far so far, so I'm not sure whether that will be finished for Drupal 8 in time. But if not, I guess it will end up being encountered. So we are almost there already, but of course we are not fully done, and we're actually working hard on the entity system right now to get ready for the Drupal 8 beta. Current work areas, things like entity cache support is not in yet, for it's mostly ready. It shouldn't be a problem, but more work is still going on a topic which is called automatic database schema generation. It's basically will do away with hook schema for your content entities. So the goal is that you can just define like a new content entity class. You define all the base fields, and you don't have to take care of the schema anymore, as it will be generated and automatically created for you. And it's in particular important for the multilingual initiative, and it will, as it will enable us to have translatable storage automatically generated for all of our entity types of core. Like if you want to translate taxonomy terms, right now the term name is not translatable, as we just missed the translatable data storage, and it's a lot of work to change all the storage. So actually we figured it's better we we work on automatic schema generation to solve that for all entity types automatically. So that's being worked on hard, and we'll have that ready for the beta. So I'm really looking forward to that, because I think it enables us to make use of the entity system way easier. So with all that storage in place, it's really the entity system can take care of all the storage for all your entities. So as a module, you can really start reusing the entity field storage also for module data. So like when you're writing a module and you need to store something for some entities, you can use the field system and the entity system to do that. And as there's no UI exposure at all required, it's really decoupled. So I think that's really convenient, because it really also has the potential to get more benefits. Like you could also automatically generate the Fuse integration out of that. So once that's done, your module-specific storage would be covered as well. So if you want to help, get involved, we have a meta issue, which also is good just for tracking status, which is called Complete the Entity Field API. There's also a Rocketship site, which just is an overview of all the issues being worked on. It's at entity.worldempire.ch. And we are doing weekly ISC meetings in Drupal-entity. And they are actually happening at Central Summertime, so at 6 o'clock our time. Any questions? So I talked already too lot and everyone wants to go for break. Okay then, thank you.